The U.S. national debt has reached an alarming new milestone, surpassing any point in the country's history. As of 2024, the debt has ballooned to $35 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's more than $100,000 in debt for every American. What's even more concerning is that this year, the U.S. government will spend almost $900 billion just on interest payments. That's more than the nation spends on its entire military, and more than the entire yearly budget of wealthy, medium-sized countries like Spain. If that sounds like an unsustainable situation, it's because it is. But as troubling as those numbers are, they only represent the start of the problem. The true challenge lies in the fact that the national debt keeps growing every day. In fact, it's currently increasing by $1 trillion every 100 days, and this pace is accelerating. Even more concerning is that the U.S. government doesn't appear to have any solid plan for how to stop this trend. There seems to be no serious effort to rein in the growing debt, and even if they tried, it's uncertain whether they would succeed. Worse yet, the government itself expects the problem to worsen over time, and even for the world's largest economy, this situation could eventually spiral out of control. How did we get here? To understand how the U.S. reached this point, it's helpful to think about government debt in the same way you might think about personal debt. Just like individuals take out loans to buy a car or a home, governments borrow money when their spending exceeds their revenue. When the government spends more than it collects in taxes, this creates what's known as a budget deficit. To make up for this shortfall, the government borrows money, adding to the national debt. The U.S. government typically borrows money by issuing treasury bonds. Investors, both domestic and foreign, purchase these bonds with the understanding that the government will repay them with interest. But as the debt grows, lenders may begin to see the U.S. as a riskier borrower, demanding higher interest rates. This increases the cost for the government to service its debt, meaning that more and more money goes toward paying interest rather than funding programs like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. As the debt continues to grow, it becomes harder and harder to escape from this cycle. More borrowing leads to higher interest payments, which means even more borrowing just to keep up. This can create what's known as a debt spiral, a self-reinforcing loop where debt accumulates faster than it can be repaid. If investors ever lose confidence in a country's ability to manage its debt, it can trigger a debt crisis where borrowing costs skyrocket and the entire financial system begins to unravel. We've seen this play out in countries around the world, from Greece to Argentina, where unsustainable debt led to economic collapse. While the U.S. might seem immune due to its economic size and global influence, it isn't invincible. The country's debt level is currently over 120% of its gross domestic product, GDP, a ratio that's alarming even when compared to other advanced economies. And that ratio continues to grow. The rise of U.S. debt, a brief history. While the U.S. has carried debt for much of its history, it wasn't always at today's staggering levels. The national debt began to rise significantly in the 1980s, driven by a combination of tax cuts, increased military spending, and slower economic growth. However, the most dramatic surge occurred in the 21st century. The 2008 financial crisis forced the U.S. government to spend massive amounts of money on bank bailouts and stimulus packages to stabilize the economy. These measures helped prevent a complete economic collapse, but at the cost of dramatically increasing the national debt. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in trillions of dollars being injected into the economy through relief packages, further pushing the debt to record highs. While emergency spending during crises can be justified, the current situation is different. In 1946, after the enormous costs of World War II, U.S. debt reached similar levels. However, the government at that time cut back on spending in the post-war years, and the debt quickly returned to more manageable levels. Today, we're seeing the opposite. The U.S. isn't involved in a global war, nor is it grappling with a major pandemic. Yet the government continues to spend far more than it brings in. In 2023, for example, the U.S. ran a budget deficit of $1.7 trillion. For every dollar the government earns in revenue, it spends $1.25, and the difference is made up by borrowing. Compounding the issue, rising interest rates mean that the cost of servicing the debt has become one of the largest expenditures for the federal government, surpassing even Medicare and defense spending. If an individual handled their finances this way, borrowing more and more to cover everyday expenses, it would be clear that they were headed for financial ruin. But when governments do the same, it often goes unnoticed or ignored. This creates little incentive for politicians to address the issue, especially when the solutions, tax increases or spending cuts, are deeply unpopular with voters. Can the U.S. pay off its debt? In theory, the U.S. could pay off its debt, but in practice, it's highly unlikely. The debt is simply too large, and paying it down would require drastic measures that are politically and economically difficult to implement. However, the U.S. doesn't necessarily need to pay off its debt entirely. Many countries, including some of the world's wealthiest, carry national debt. The goal is to keep the debt at a manageable level. The real concern is that the U.S. national debt isn't being managed at all. It's growing uncontrollably, and if that continues, the consequences could be severe. In the short term, the government could be forced to cut spending on essential services like infrastructure, education, and innovation. In the long term, if the debt becomes truly unmanageable, the U.S. could face a debt crisis. A debt crisis occurs when investors lose confidence in a government's ability to repay its loans. This leads to skyrocketing borrowing costs, which forces the government to adopt extreme austerity measures, slashing spending and raising taxes just to stay afloat. In even more extreme cases, a country can default on its debt, essentially declaring bankruptcy. Why the U.S. is different? While the U.S. faces serious risks from its mounting debt, it also has a unique advantage. The U.S. dollar is the world's primary reserve currency. This gives the U.S. more flexibility when it comes to borrowing, because there's a constant global demand for dollars and U.S. Treasury bonds. In other words, the rules that apply to other countries don't always apply to the U.S. However, this doesn't mean the U.S. is immune to the consequences of excessive debt. Continued borrowing without any checks could eventually undermine confidence in the dollar, leading to higher interest rates, inflation, or even a loss of the dollar's reserve currency status. While these are worst-case scenarios and may not happen in the immediate future, they highlight the fact that no country can defy basic economic principles forever. Sooner or later, the U.S. government will need to confront its debt problem. If it fails to act, the country could be on a dangerous path toward financial instability. While the U.S. has more economic power and influence than any other nation, even it cannot afford to spend beyond its means forever. Without significant changes, the current trajectory could lead to an outcome that is both painful and inevitable. If you found this video insightful and want to learn more about global financial issues, geopolitical events, and economic trends, be sure to subscribe to my newsletter for regular updates and analysis. You can find the link to sign up in the description below. Thanks for watching.